One of the critical problems of our time is the problem of government. We today misunderstand the meaning of government because we identify it with the state, that is, with the federal government or the state government. In reality, government has historically meant something very different. It has meant, first of all, the self-government of the Christian man. The basic government in any society is the individual, his life, his conduct of his affairs. This is government. Then second, the basic institutional form of government is the family. Throughout history, the family has exercised more government than any other agency. It is, after all, man's first government, man's first church, first school, first vocation. So the family is a very important form of government, and we neglect it to our peril. Then third, we must recognize the church is a government. Unfortunately, today it doesn't govern sufficiently, but it is a government. The school is also a government. Then our vocations, our jobs govern us. For one thing, they tell us what time of the day we're going to wake up and what time of the day we can go home. On the job, we are governed by the requirements of our work. Then society at large governs us. All the multiple institutions and agencies in a free society are forms of government, and they have a powerful impact on our lives. We are members of many, we submit to their rules and their regulations, or we form associations. We are governed by what people think of us. This is a real form of government. Finally, one form of government among many is civil government. Up until about 1860, people in this country did not talk about government if they meant Washington, D.C. They always said civil government, a very important distinction. For us to use the word government, meaning the federal government or any state agency, is to be implicitly totalitarian. We are then equating government with civil government. We are then neglecting progressively every other form of government, which is what we have done. And what we see today is that progressively this one form of government, civil government, has taken over the life of the individual, the life of the family, of the school. In fact, a good deal of education is now statist. Of our vocations, we are governed on the job by all kinds of regulations, and also of society at large. Now, civil government is increasingly meddling in the life of the church. This is dangerous. It is the highway to totalitarianism. Now, what we must recognize, therefore, is that unless we take back government from the state, we cannot reverse this trend. To a considerable degree, civil government has taken over many areas precisely because we, the people, have abdicated those areas. We refuse to govern ourselves or our families. And as a result, Washington, D.C. and some agency of state intervenes. And so we have increasingly the equation of government with the state. It does not take a revolution to make us totalitarian. This will do it if we stop governing ourselves. This is the key. What are you doing about it?
Martin, the libertarians say smash the state, and a lot of conservatives would applaud that idea. Is government a bad thing? No, government is not intrinsically a bad concept. The archetype of government is God himself, his government over his creation. All other forms of government are derivative, including civil government. It's merely when civil government starts to break the bounds for which it was created that it becomes, in fact, a tyranny. And under that condition, I can see the libertarians' point of view. They've seen tremendous excesses in the way that government's been structured, the way that abuses have multiplied, and therefore their intention is to destroy the entirety of the structure, to forsake the concept entirely. But that, in fact, is erroneous. The point is that when you are apart from the cornerstone laid, you're basically building on sand. And as we continue to build on sand, we get a gigantic structure, the one that the libertarians decry, that in fact can become a tyrant. That's their objection, but the solution is not destruction. The solution is reconstruction, refounding basically government on its own principle, the biblical principles, allowing that God is the governor among nations.
Stop right there, because a lot of people, and again, I'm sad to say a lot of them who call themselves Christians would say, the Bible doesn't really say anything about the government, that this is a very dangerous thing to take the Bible and start trying to apply verses to the actual government, the state.
No, you're wrong, because the Son was born to us, a child was given, and the government would be on his shoulders. In Revelation, same concept. A child was born who was to be ruler over all the nations of the earth. That's plain, blatant statement. The Christians are not able to accept the implications of God's government, and they've already forsaken their own Lord. Lord is the governor of the nations. All the families of nations shall worship him and obey his law. His law word will go forth. His scepter shall go forth from Jerusalem to the ends of the world. If they're not willing to accept the rod of God as a sheep, then they'll be as the wolves. They'll be beaten off from the flock.
Let me throw out another question, and anybody can pick up on it who wants to. Congressman Jack Kemp, a Republican from New York, has said in an interview in the Wall Street Journal that the big government issue, the fight about big government, is a dead issue, and that it's a loser at the polls, and that it's just one that doesn't interest anybody anymore. Can we as Christians buy the idea that the big government issue is dead?
Well, I don't know about Congressman Kemp. I'm surprised to hear he discussed anything beyond taxes and the economy. But most Americans, when I was a boy, were relatively unaware of the government. The first income tax that I paid was in the late 30s, and it amounted to about $15. And everyone said to me, "You must be making a lot of money." I bragged about it, I'm sorry to say. Well, now the government, of course, is right here. It's on top. And there isn't any way that we can escape the idea of government. You asked me some time back, or you mentioned some time back, why didn't businessmen sponsor publications and so forth that protect the free enterprise system? Well, I asked a retired banker if he would lend some money or give some money to human events some years ago. And he said, "Why should I want to be audited by the IRS? The government has a great deal to do with creating fear." So I think Kemp is trying to appeal not to the ordinary person, but possibly to the votes of the bureaucrats.
Rush, a lot of conservatives, and you know some of them, and many of them are good people, do say, that the only thing wrong with government, by which they usually mean Washington, D.C., is that it's running a big deficit. It doesn't pay its bills. The implication being that if the budget was balanced, then basically everything would be all right, which means that they see nothing wrong with any of the functions that the civil government in Washington is performing. Even if the budget was balanced, does this solve all of our problems as far as government is concerned?
No, I wouldn't be surprised if the Soviet Union operates with a balanced budget, whatever their accounting system may be. The problem today is that both parties and the majority of the American people trust in civil government. They look to it for the answers, not to God. Their hope of salvation is from the state, not from the Lord. As a result, both parties operate on false premises. And it isn't enough to say we will balance the budget, or we will have better national defense or less national defense and more for internal programs, all these incidentals, because that's what they are on the last analysis, may be good or bad. But the basic problem is there is too much trust in the state, in the federal government.
Let me give you an example of that that's almost a comical example. When the stock market crashed on October 19th, on the CBS Evening News, the economic correspondent Ray Brady interviewed a number of people, and then he summed up his report by saying that everyone on Wall Street was basically looking to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And then he paused and he said, but there was confusion there too. And I thought, wow, this is really a news bulletin, you know? They should have interrupted programming for this. Confusion in Washington. Can you imagine that? Confusion. In other words, we had the calamity, the volcano exploded, and does America get on its face to God? Seek His counsel? No. Everyone turned to Washington, D.C.
Well, the people have been told this in so many different ways that the average American today does believe that the government is responsible for the quality of life, as Lyndon Johnson said, is responsible for poverty, as our social scientists say, is responsible for all the conditions of the world. Now, my mother's family was working class people. They never really knew that they were poor. They owned their own home. They had good clothes for Sunday, and they had regular clothes the rest of the week, paid their bills, had no debts, did not consider themselves poor people at all. And yet, when I look back at their standard of living, it was very Spartan. There were very few luxuries. And today, they would be qualified as very poor people, people who would probably qualify, if not for welfare, at least for some form of aid. But the idea that you are responsible for yourself. Eric Hoffer, the longshore philosopher, was asked to write an article for the New York Times Magazine about what the Americans owe the black working people. And he said, my hands are as calloused as anyone else's. And the black longshoremen that come into the hiring hall have to work the same as I do, and I don't owe them anything. Mm. Well, of course, he never again appeared in print in the New York Times book magazine.
Well, I tell you, I wouldn't have wanted to be the one who told Eric Hoffer that his article was not going to be printed. But one of the things that strikes me is that I'm 46 years old, seen a few national elections. They were elections that were purportedly between different parties. They were elections that were purportedly between the far left and the far right. But the one thing that all the candidates have in common at virtually every level of government in all of these elections is that no one raises basic questions about what the function of government is. What is a legitimate function? What is illegitimate? It's a debate that's between very narrow parameters, sort of a green eye shade, numbers crunching kind of debate about how much should we spend exactly, where should we direct this. No, and I'm being very literal. I'm saying no debate of any substance about the role of the state.
Yes.
Because the terms that the debate would have been conducted in have all been co-opted by the left. Friedrich Hayek, in his work The Road to Serfdom, points out that there was a subtle change in the 19th century whereby the socialists co-opted the whole liberal tradition in the West. And they did it by changing the definition of freedom. Freedom used to mean freedom from coercion. And Hayek points out that the socialists began using it in the sense of freedom from want. And in that definition, the whole view of society has changed, and the whole view of government has changed. Government now becomes a provider rather than a protector.
You know what comes to my mind is what George Wallace once said, that there wasn't a dime's worth of difference. Of course, this was at a time of a little better economic...
The English Spectator, every issue, puts out a little box on 100 years ago. And recently they had a box on 100 years ago, in the late 1880s. There was a deer park on an island off the coast of Britain. And the laborers in that area said that they needed food, and they went in and they were killing the deer. They were arrested for that, and they were fined. The Spectator went on to say, we are not in favor of a deer park. We think this is a misuse of property. On the other hand, we do not believe that men can convert their needs into rights. And we cannot allow this invasion of the rights of property. Now, I think that was a remarkable statement. When you look at any publication that would take such an attitude today, what would happen? Would they be driven out of their editorial offices and lashed, or what?
Well, one would hope. The Bambi lobby, I guess you
I
call
see.
it, the pro-Bambi lobby.
One of the fundamental problems here is that this whole area of government abuse goes back thousands of years. In the Roman coinage, Ethelbert Stauffer shows that the particular reigning Caesar would indicate on the coinage that not only being the Pontifex Maximus of the empire, he was also the Savior, the only one to whom everyone wants to pray. So he made the famous phrase, "There's no other name under heaven under which anyone can be saved rather than Caesar Augustus," whoever the particular. And this has been government as savior. Messianic statism has been the implied function of government, the one that you say goes unstated, that in fact the state is looked to as a Messiah, as a savior. Being a provider of economic material is just one element of it, but via the element of education which it entered, it took the children. Children now are under the government's direct control, insofar as now you can control the future. So you do have this tentacle of government stretching out, because the Messiah, whoever it's going to be, will have to have total control.
All right, everybody sees the problem now. I mean, they see their taxes. They see the inefficient, expensive way that the state does everything. So what is the way out?
We come from a tradition that goes all the way back to Sinai, and that tradition is a tradition of government limited by law, that government is not God, God is God, and his law is ultimate under the sun. And civil government, and Rush has written on this extensively, civil government, church government, family government, commercial government are all under God's law. Nobody is above the law. Each have a prescribed sphere in which they have been set up, in which they must operate, and if they don't operate, then tyranny, breakdown, fraud, abuse, waste, you name it, follow. And that's the situation we're in. We are not arguing for a return to the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages you had not so much the tyranny of the state as you had the church tyrannizing society at points. In the Middle Ages you also had the state doing that too. The fact is that the family is so small, it's never going to tyrannize the rest of society.
This phrase you just used, no one is above the law, this reminds you, we heard this ad nauseum during the Watergate thing, during the Iran-Contra thing. What the guys in the Congress who say that mean, of course, is that no one is above our law, except, of course, us. Because most of the civil rights laws that the Congress has passed are not binding on the Congress. Did you know that? They are not subject to affirmative action laws, to a whole series of laws that they have passed to govern us and all the other poor saps in this country who are not serving in Congress, but they don't bind themselves with their own law.
But Bill was saying something even better, even more sweeping. He was saying that, in effect, the power of civil government, including Congress, should be reduced. Right now, we don't know what the limits of Congress are. They must be limited. The power of our government as such must be reduced, and the power of the people must be increased. We are talking now about expanding freedom and responsibility. The family's freedom should be expanded. Parental control over their children should be restored and taken away from the social scientists, the government, and the school teachers. Freedom of people in various vocations should be restored. You realize that during the Middle Ages, the cities had certain rights and privileges. The various guilds had certain rights. The people had votes. They enacted their own laws. The Renaissance introduced despotism. And our historians don't extol the Middle Ages for very good reason, because the Middle Ages was a period of individual freedom. They extol the Renaissance, which is a period of despotism, because you had the paradox of a rising standard of living and a dropping standard of personal and individual liberty, which we are now repeating. And there isn't any way that we can avoid the vice that is squeezing us in, excepting to go back to a Christian system.
I wanted to pick up on that and ask you a question, Rush. You talk about we don't really know the limits of Congress' power. If you mean by their desire to assert their own power, I don't think we've seen the limits of it. But certainly we do know the limits of the power, and it's limited by God's law, and it's limited whether they acknowledge it or not. And I'd like you to talk for a second here about that aspect of, regardless of what the people in Congress think they're doing, what they're doing apart from God is not working, is it?
No, it is not. Forrest McDonald, in one of his several excellent studies of the U.S. Constitution, titles his last chapter Breakdown. He feels that since 1980, the federal government has been in process of breaking down. It has assumed so many powers, it has become so vast that it is losing the ability to function. So its grasp of power has been a judgment on itself. Now, it is interesting that this breakdown has happened under an ostensibly conservative administration. Both parties have been very good at criticizing the moral failures of the other party when they are out of power, but they pursue the same course of the expansion of power when they take office. Well, the result is we are facing now worldwide judgment in every sphere, and certainly one of them is the growing breakdown of the modern state.
But wait a second, I want to pick on this because this is a very important thing, because there would be a strong temptation now when you say, well, the government's breaking down, or Forrest McDonald says it, for us to go, all right, this is really great. Libertarians, of course, would cheer. A lot of conservatives would say, yeah, but why is this a very dangerous thing if the government breaks down?
It is dangerous because we are a part of that social order, and we are going to pay a price for that breakdown in the political and the economic and every other sphere. So we're going to be hurt. It's a necessary judgment, and we're not going to escape our part in it.
We have a paradox, John. We have a paradox where the collapse of authority leads to absolute authority.
That's right. Okay, that's what, well, as one
Yes,
who wrote a
very
book
good.
on the French Revolution, you could tell us at length and in detail the consequences of the government being utterly
I
destroyed.
think, yes, the point about the committees for public safety and purges, that's a point you ought to make.
Well,
Yes.
the French Revolution was launched from inside the Parliament of France. They set up committees. The committees rewrote the Constitution, and then they had elections, and the new Constitution was ratified. The king was reduced to a constitutional monarch. The nobles were stripped of their property, so was the church. Then they began a series of trials inside the Parliament, hearings into corruption of the preceding regime. And the trials expanded from corruption to treason against the state in all kinds of matters, and eventually to the death sentence and to the terror. Now, all these orders are issued from the offices of government, not from the street and not from the mob, but from highly educated officials elected to office who said we act in the name of the people. And we're seeing a replay of that pattern, which incidentally was repeated in the Russian Duma, it was repeated in the German Reichstag, and is being repeated in the United States Congress. These trials, and there are trials, they
Well,
say, oh, well, we're not going to put you, you don't need a lawyer, but you can be ruined. I understand that Ollie North is going to be indicted. I understand that a great many other people are going to go to prison. Before they're through, they will have a purge.
The modern temper in politics is to destroy the other side, to destroy the other person. We used to grant exile even to dictators,
Oh, yes.
but we no longer do so on the grounds that somehow we are going to play God over them and we're going to turn them over to people for trial. Now, what was the Latin American tradition?
Oh, well, exile, of course, was a refuge, and if you allowed a man sanctuary, you were honor-bound to obey it. Perez Jimenez came up from Venezuela and moved into his house in Miami, Florida, because Eisenhower invited him into the United States as an exile. John Kennedy listening to the pro rata, the sort of routine request by the Venezuelan government to extradite Pérez Jiménez back, thought he would get along better with the South Americans if he turned Pérez Jiménez over, and he did. And the Latin Americans were shocked. They said the Americans have no honor. And they weren't going to put the former president of Venezuela in prison. They confined him to 2 floors of a luxury hotel with his entourage. They had a formal trial. They found him guilty of some minor embezzlements, and he went to Madrid. Well, since John Kennedy, we have mistreated the Shah of Iran, a former ally. We are now holding Marcos a prisoner and are prepared to turn him over to the tender mercies of his enemies in the Philippines. We are demanding of France that they do something about young Duvalier, because the whole idea of refuge and sanctuary is now demolished. We are sending people back to the Iron Curtain countries to be executed.
Yes. In other words, because we don't believe in heaven and hell, we want everything settled in this world. And like God, we're going to judge everybody and see that they get punished here and now.
Oh, what a wonderful point.
And this is why we are intolerant of one another. We cannot live together, so that both sides regard the other side as absolutely evil, to be destroyed, and so on.
Don't let the other fellow escape.
Yes. No forbearance, no saying they may be guilty of evils, but God ultimately is the judge, and there are limits to our ability to be judges.
Nobody on earth escapes the consequences of sin. The fact that you don't see it is irrelevant.
There was an excellent book that Rush reviewed and that I read, and a number of other people did. It was called Torture by Peters.
Yes.
I don't remember his first name. But he does a superlative study that fits right in with Fritz Kern's study on medieval government. And Kern shows in his classic study that the early Middle Ages were a time of freedom and the limitation of government by law. You did not have absolute monarchs prior to the 12th century in Europe. And it's only after the reintroduction of Roman law and of Aristotelian politics that you have the rise of torture and the rise of absolute governments. The Holy Inquisition was not to be laid at the doorstep of the Church. It was to be laid at the doorstep of Greco-Roman culture and politics, which came back in with a vengeance.
Yes.
And Frederick II.
All right. This is getting a little too learned here. I'm sorry. You want to make a big point?
That's exactly right. Torture began with the Renaissance, with the loss of faith in heaven and hell, with the feeling that they had to settle all scores here and now. And totalitarianism has risen again as men have lost faith, and they want to play the total judges here on earth, so that it's dangerous for society when men lose faith in heaven and hell, because then they are going to try to produce the hell for all sinners or evildoers here and now.
Well, if you don't believe in God, all is permitted. There is no sense of guilt. So you have two things. You have the spread of evil, and you have the spread of the judges and the torturers, the inquisitors, the censors, and so forth.
What might an average person's taxation be like compared to what it is now if we had a biblical form of government? How would they compare and contrast?
Yes. According to God's law, both in church and state, there are to be limited powers. So the worshiping institution in God's law is limited to 1/10 of the tithe, which the Levites gave to the priests. Similarly, the civil government was limited to half a shekel for all males 18 years old and older, the same amount. So that the power of church and state were alike limited. The two areas were areas of very limited powers. And we have seen both gain tremendous powers, and not to the benefit of men. We have to restore power to the individual and to the family, and create institutions that will minister to the various sectors of human need, of society, charitable needs, medical needs, educational needs. We are now supplying a high percentage of the education in this country. From 30 to 35% of the children of this country are in Christian schools or Christian home schools. That's a tremendous fact. We're taking back government and creating a non-political form of rule.
If we had a biblical form of civil government, can you name a function or two that most people might associate with civil government now that for the most part probably would no longer exist?
One of them would be education. Another would be charity. Health would be another. There are a number of spheres, but I must say this. Social financing has to be provided. And the state must do it if the people won't do it. And what we need to do as a Christian people is to take back these spheres from Washington. Then and then alone can we complain. But now, since we're not doing it, we have no right to say welfarism on the part of Washington is evil.
So if we're going to get good government, we as individual citizens then have to be responsible and start being governors ourselves.
Exactly.
Otherwise, we can't cry about Washington.
Well, good government is godly government, and indeed this is going to have to be taken back, Rush, I can assure you, because I've just come from Washington and there ain't too many folks there who are about to give up their power, even though we pay their salary. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.